Sergei Surovikin, known as a close friend of Vladimir Putin, is in big trouble. $1 million reward has been placed on the head of Surovikin, known as the criminal general, who turned out to support the coup attempt in Russia by Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin. The Russian oligarchs, who are under Putin's control, mobilized mercenaries to capture Surovikin after closed doors. It is still unknown where Surovikin, who suddenly disappeared, is hiding as it is known. Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Wagner mercenary company, recently entered the Russian cities of Rostov and Voronezh with his soldiers and took control there. Prigozhin, who captured the Russian army building in the city of Rostov without firing a single bullet, managed to repel all the Russian soldiers there. The fact that the Russian soldiers voluntarily left the management of the city to the Wagner soldiers without response in any way created a big question mark in the minds. However, the real face of the business was found out later. It turned out that the vast majority of Russian soldiers serving in the city of Rostov were soldiers who were under the command of Sergei Surovikin at the beginning of the war. Sergei Surovikin was appointed commander of the Russian army by Vladimir Putin. The first thing that Russian General Surovikin did as soon as he took office was to create special military units for himself. Surovikin first withdrew the soldiers he had fought with in Syria and formed a special unit that was completely under his command. Over time, the increase in the number of soldiers in this unit attracted the attention of Russian government officials, and Putin was warned about it. Surovikin, who gained power very quickly within the army, managed to gain the respect of the Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine in a short time. The biggest reason for this was the attacks that Surovikin committed on Ukrainian territory after he took office. The Russian military, accompanied by Surovikin, began conducting airstrikes on several cities on Ukrainian territory. Surovikin, who was tried for war crimes he had committed before, never hesitated to commit war crimes. However, this situation has received harsh criticism from the United States and Western countries. After a while, Surovikin and Vladimir Putin began to contradict on this issue. But the point that really annoyed Putin was that Surovikin rose so quickly within the army and took control of the army after the war began. Many anti-war and anti-Putin protests were held within the borders of Russia for this reason. Vladimir Putin was very afraid that a coup attempt against him would take place. Sergei Surovikin was at the top of the list of names who could carry out this coup. Thus, Surovikin was dismissed again soon after taking office. Now, it turned out that the Russian soldiers who did not intervene at all against the Wagner soldiers who captured the city of Rostov were soldiers under the command of Surovikin. Things got even more complicated when it was learned that Surovikin had sent orders to his own soldiers not to interfere in this coup. When it became known that Surovikin had supported the coup, the Russian general Surovikin suddenly disappeared. Like Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, Sergei Surovikin is also thought to have fled to the borders of Belarus. Alexander Lukashenko, who is known as a close friend of Putin, has left a question mark in the minds of why he is protecting these coup plotters. Putin has made it clear that he will not be prosecuted for this coup attempt organized by Wagner soldiers. However, the same does not apply to Sergei Surovikin. Vladimir Putin did not issue a warrant for Surovikin's arrest on behalf of the state, but according to statements by Russian opposition officials, there was a warrant issued for Sergei Surovikin. Putin has contacted the Russian oligarchs with whom he has close relations and has sent news to all the mercenaries located within the borders of Belarus. However, although this arrest decision was made by Russian oligarchs, the real name behind the decision is Russian leader Vladimir Putin. It is said that $1 million reward has been placed on Sergei Surovikin's head for the moment. But for Surovikin to be tried in the Russian judiciary, he must be captured alive. This news has greatly shaken the world's media right now. The fact that Russian General Sergei Surovikin has still not been heard from has led to the emergence of news that Surovikin has been captured. Russians are being put to death on Ukrainian soil. Relatives of citizens serving in the military rush to the streets. People who demanded Putin's resignation organized unruly demonstrations. The populace has unified against Putin's despotic rule. The demonstrations led to chaos. Putin had no choice but to be concerned by the circumstances. Following these responses, nations began issuing declarations of support for Ukraine's struggle for independence. Putin's lack of a plan to end the incursions altered the circumstances for the nations that had repeatedly implored Russia to withdraw its troops. A number of countries entered the conflict and assumed the position of the Ukraine after Putin disregarded the responses. Vladimir Putin is more perturbed than he anticipated by the daily increase in Ukraine's aid. Putin anticipated that the invasion would be over in a matter of weeks due to the fact that he had occupied more than half of the country in a matter of weeks. However, the balance of power has shifted as a result of these countries' intervention and Ukraine's enormous defense due to the shift in the power balance. Russia, which was unprepared for such a protracted conflict, lost a substantially larger number of soldiers than anticipated. As Russia, which had not anticipated these numbers, became in need of assistance, these soldiers attempted to aid the populace. The responses to the incorporation of non-military civilians in the conflicts were avalanche-like. Increasing numbers of citizens participated in daily demonstrations calling for Putin's resignation. Primarily civilians who joined the conscription of their peers sparked protests. The vast majority consisted of wives whose husbands had been deployed to the front lines. Upon discovering that Ukraine has assumed control of the conflict, these women are aware that their husbands have been executed. People whose families were devastated in an instant had no choice but to take to the streets to demand their rights. Putin continued to implement his policies regardless of the dire circumstances, ignoring the demonstrations. Putin, who believes that by electing individuals from minority and disadvantaged areas, the voices of these individuals will be marginalized, has been rendered stupefied by these more obscene demonstrations. These rallies, which reached the Kremlin, put Putin and Kremlin lawmakers in a precarious position as the conflict persisted for months. Fires began to break out around the Kremlin, and improvised explosives began to be launched into the air in response to these occurrences. Putin's decision to grant bureaucrats the highest level of authority has resulted in horrific treatment of the populace. Russian citizens were assailed with violence and detained. Russian security forces with unrestricted authority do not know when to cease interfering in the public sphere. To avoid having its voice suppressed, however, the public resorted to much more expensive measures around the Kremlin. Buildings and vehicles were vandalized and massive flames were set. Despite the calamity of these events, the loss of independence had the greatest impact on the Russian people. Citizens attempting to conduct their cases attempt to communicate their concerns through the media. Those who claimed to be under a government they did not desire and demanded a prompt change of power were met with an unexpected response. Putin, rather than listening to the people, decided to limit the influence of journalists. Putin, who prohibited the publication of any negative news about himself, took the same posture regarding the war's progression, regarding Russia's loss of military superiority and Ukraine's victories. The Russian press has maintained deafening silence. Instead, it is erroneously reported that Russia has the upper hand and that the battle will end soon. These slanted media outlets consistently produce Putin's supporters. Putin has lost the trust of those who are cognizant that the information they are receiving is false. Since the beginning of the conflict, Vladimir Putin has repeatedly deceived the populace. Putin is also aware that the effects of the conflict have extended beyond Ukraine's borders and into his own country. On the other hand, citizens are immune to the press indoctrination and have easy access to accurate information. In contrast, the Russian government attempts to isolate its citizens from the rest of the world by restricting access to a variety of internet sites. People are particularly concerned that the conflict could spread to Russia's borders when Moscow entered Ukraine's range. Russians, who had recently encountered a great deal of anxiety, abandoned this location. Thus, Russian citizens demand the urgent withdrawal of these incursions of their own volition. Russia is responding because since the outset of the conflict, it has kept its military posture a secret, even though the Ukrainian government provides frequent updates. Russia's lack of transparency indicates they are in an inexplicably difficult situation. This information is being concealed primarily because Russia, which is experiencing financial deficits, is experiencing an increase in ammunition shortages because Russia's reputation and Ukraine's capacity to go on the offensive to end the conflict would be damaged if the extent of its weakness were revealed. In response, Ukraine conducted a thorough investigation of the damage caused to Russia and shared its findings with the international community. Numerous advanced weapons and vehicles possessed by Russia at the outset of the conflict were discovered to have been destroyed. The destruction of these munitions, which was precipitated by Ukraine's astute tactics, caused incalculable damage to the Russian military. In contrast, the Ukraine, which has received substantial aid from a number of nations, continues to fight valiantly. The absence of a response from the Russian government to the statements made about Russia indicates that these analyses are accurate. However, among these explanations, the loss of personnel is the most appalling. On Ukrainian soil, an estimated 150,000 Russian personnel perished. According to estimates, the fact that the majority of these combatants were forced civilians sparked global outrage. The Russian citizenry rallied in support of citizens who were scheduled for execution. It is common knowledge that the headquarters neglected the basic requirements of conscripted citizens. Thus, it is said that hunger and diseases consume and ruin the exhausted bodies of warriors. It is common knowledge that the vast majority of Russian politicians oppose conflict. Putin, who has been in office for over 2 decades, continues to face pressure from politicians who believe he should resign. Citizens' trust in the opposition increased as a consequence of the opposition party's reassuring statements which reduced public anxiety. The opposition party's most significant pledge was that if elected, they would immediately end the war and end the invasions. In the past year, these organizations have been a beacon of hope for the people oppressed by Vladimir Putin's regime. These parties are anticipated to play a significant role in Putin's resignation as a result. Putin has begun to implement policies aimed at silencing all of his opponents. However, it is believed that Putin cannot continue these tactics indefinitely. Ukraine 54. The artillery brigade conducted a major operation against the occupying Russian forces in Kharkiv. 400 Russian soldiers were neutralized by the ordnance unit that was blocking the Russian headquarters as it began to lose strength on Ukrainian territory. The Russian army, which had been on the offensive since the beginning of the conflict, began to adopt a more defensive stance. The Russian army, which has been losing ground in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, is presently launching a major offensive against Ukrainian forces on the Bakhmut front. The 11-kilometer defensive wall constructed by the Ukrainian army near Bakhmut prevents the passage of Russian forces on the instructions of Russian Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov. However, the vast majority of Russian troops in the Donetsk region were transferred to the Bakhmut front. Wagner mercenaries recently captured the city of Soldau, which contains a significant number of Wagner warriors. When the Ukrainian intelligence service discovered that Wagner personnel in Solidar would also be transferred to the Bakhmut front, it launched a different operation to turn the Russian forces against them. Yevgeny Prigozhin, a member of the Wagner mercenary organization, assumes positions on the battlefield to keep a close watch on his own soldiers. Prigozhin, who commanded his soldiers in this region, started sending his troops towards the Bakhmut region on the orders of Gerasimov, chief of the Russian General Staff. Gerasimov, dissatisfied, determined to dispatch the Russian army and forces stationed in the Kharkiv region to the Bakhmut front. The 400 soldiers at the Russian headquarters in the Balaklia neighborhood of Kharkiv initiated preparations for deployment to the front. In contrast, the Ukrainian army had a different strategy to halt the men at these headquarters. The age of Ukraine, whose name is frequently mentioned in battle, is 54 years. The artillery brigade launched a massive endeavor to prevent the Russian army from launching a large-scale offensive against Bakhmut. Ukraine is rated number 54. His brigade would divert the attention of the Russian forces in another direction, allowing the occupying forces in Bakhmut to be moved to Kharkiv. Since months ago, the Ukrainian army has been amassing forces in Lyman and Izum to communities in the Donetsk region that it liberated from Russian control. These two districts were formerly occupied by the Ukrainian 54th Ukrainian Army, a favored unit of the Ukrainian Army. The artillery brigade had defended the city against Russian occupation. Now he is attempting to stop Russian forces from departing Kharkiv for Bakhmut, 54, which launched service in Izum and Lyman. The artillery brigade, equipped with 20 tanks and 12 armored vehicles, marched towards the Russian headquarters in Kharkiv. Ukrainian unmanned combat aircraft launched from Izum and conducted reconnaissance over the Russian headquarters during the reconnaissance mission conducted by 2 unmanned combat aircraft. It was determined that the Russian headquarters harbored nearly 350 personnel. Ukraine 54, which acted after discovering where the Russian headquarters were located. The artillery brigade, accompanied by tanks, set out to obstruct the Russian headquarters. Ukrainian personnel, while supported by Ukrainian tanks, attempted to engage Russian forces in crossfire while surrounding the headquarters. The Russian soldiers who were preparing to depart the headquarters panicked upon spotting the approaching Ukrainian army. When the Russian soldiers saw the Ukrainian tanks in front of them, they were stunned by their experiences. Simultaneously, the Ukrainian army launched missiles against the Russian headquarters using mortars stationed on the structure. The Ukrainian military began bombarding the Russian headquarters with Abrams tanks supplied by the United States. As a result of witnessing the explosions at the headquarters, the Russian soldiers panicked and began rushing around in confusion. The Russian soldiers continued to flee despite orders from their commander to hold their positions and form a defensive line. Ukraine 54. The artillery brigade, aided by tanks, breached the barbed wire encircled, calling the headquarters and gained entry as Ukrainian tanks approached the headquarters. Russian personnel began to withdraw. Within hours, the Ukrainian artillery brigade captured the Russian headquarters in Kharkiv, dealing a significant blow to the Russian military. The Russian troops that were to be transferred to the Bakhmut front were defeated, and the Ukrainian army in Bakhmut was provided with aid. The 54th, which assumed command of the Russians. The Union commander of the artillery brigade made statements regarding the action. According to the Ukrainian commander, the detained Russian soldiers fought alongside the partial mobilization headquarters on Ukrainian soil. Putin dispatched to Ukraine the Russian soldiers who resolved to leave rather than defend their own headquarters. The Russian headquarters in Kharkiv, Ukraine, is therefore number 54. It could have been the easiest victory ever for the artillery brigade. This operation resulted in the deaths of over 150 Russian soldiers, while the Ukrainian army captured 88 Russian soldiers, The remaining Russian troops were able to escape the command center as the conflict on Ukrainian territory intensified. Vladimir Putin began to lose command of the Russian military since Putin nominated Valery Gerasimov, the Russian chief of general staff, to command the Russian army in Ukraine. Significant Russian casualties have occurred on Ukrainian soil. Numerous Russian officials of high rank believe Valery Gerasimov mismanaged the Russian army. Ramzan Kadyrov, the commander of Chechnya, is among those who believe that Gerasimov has failed. Kadyrov's remarks infuriated Gerasimov. It is well known that Ramzan Kadyrov and Gerasimov have recently had a great deal of animosity towards one another. Recently, Kadyrov stated that Gerasimov was incapable of managing the Russian army effectively in the aftermath of the calamitous loss at Zolder, and that he should assume command of the Russian army. Gerasimov began to discriminate against Chechen forces fighting on Ukrainian soil after Kadyrov's statements. Wagner and Russian soldiers regard Chechen fighters fighting alongside the Russian army on Ukrainian territory as second-class citizens. The escalating conflict between Russian and Chechen soldiers is causing a major crisis within the Russian military. Recent hostilities between Russian and Chechen soldiers stationed at a military headquarters in Soledar have prompted widespread concern in Russia. The December statements made by the Chechen Union chief in Soledar stunned Ramzan Kadyrov. The Chechen commander indicated that the majority of the supplies transported by Vladimir Putin to Ukraine were not distributed to Chechen fighters. Between Russian and Wagner soldiers with decorum, Russian commanders provide only one daily meal to Chechen soldiers stationed at the headquarters. The Chechen commander and the Russian commander had a verbal altercation over the lack of necessary supplies for his forces. Russian and Chechen soldiers accosted one another at the headquarters as the verbal conflict escalated after the Russian unit commander punched the Chechen commander. Chechen soldiers present at the headquarters proceeded to attack the Russian commander. In addition to the chaos, Russian military forces became involved in the conflict following these clashes between Russian and Chechen forces. Russian President Vladimir Putin resolved to maintain the separation of Chechen and Russian troops stationed on Ukrainian soil in Russian-occupied portions of Ukraine's territory. Russian and Chechen soldiers were appointed to various command posts. 2,000 Chechen soldiers were recently dispatched from a Russian headquarters in the Zaporizhia region to another territory. The Israeli intelligence agency observed that a large number of soldiers were dispatched from the Russian headquarters armed with information gathered from satellite images. Although Israeli intelligence initially believed that a new attack would be launched against the Ukrainian army, this was not the case. According to the Israeli intelligence agency that was observing the Chechen army convoy, the Chechen personnel were relocated to another Russian base in the Mariupol region. As the entire world waits for the conflict to conclude, the war's violence escalates. Russian soldiers have grown weary of battling in Ukraine and are now reluctant to fight. This makes Vladimir Putin's task more difficult. Putin, who has dispatched the Russian National Guard to protect Russian soldiers who refuse to engage in combat in Ukraine, imprisoned soldiers who declined to fight. Russian soldiers who no longer wish to fight in Ukraine would be apprehended by the Russian National Guard, returned to Russia's borders, and imprisoned. It appears that Russian soldiers captured on Ukrainian territory have little choice but to surrender to the Ukrainian army. The spy hunt in Ukraine has begun. The Ukrainian army, in an important action, identified key operatives on the Belarusian border. As a result of the misinformation, Putin has become infuriated. The Ukrainian army, from which Putin removed several of his top operators in a huge operation. He will radically change the course of the conflict with this play. Russia will pay dearly for understanding the operation. Russia has entered a new stage in the Ukrainian war as a result of the KGB's efforts. One of the advantages gained by Ukrainian soldiers was decrypted. This unforeseen occurrence has significantly changed a planned operation in Ukraine to a planned operation in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army took advantage of the situation and conducted a one-by-one operation to unmask each spy. This military operation has started to shift Ukraine in a new direction. Ukraine was able to decipher the identities of all KGB spies thanks to this operation. Putin's agents have no place to hide because it was believed that one or two Ukrainian army operations had been deciphered. The Ukrainian army made efforts to conduct operations in a novel manner. At the outset of these stages, rumors of an operation spread among Ukrainian forces, DC. As a result of flag officers' observations, an increase in Russian soldiers was reported in Ukraine immediately following this rumor. This demonstrated that army spies were able to decipher every issue on this assumption. The Ukrainian army carried out one of its planned actions. This operation, conducted by Ukrainian forces, would be disastrous for Russia. However, these new developments have begun to push the surgery date ahead, and he started planning a detailed detection inquiry to find the agents within himself. Failure to identify the agents placed in one of the most critical places in the Ukrainian army in a timely manner would also result in the loss of the captured fronts. Recognizing this, the Ukrainian army has intervened, particularly in places where fighting has ceased. The region of Donetsk was at the forefront of this. Steps have already been taken to organize a massive operation in the dangerous region. The Russian army began deploying rocket launchers armed with armor-piercing missiles to the area after learning that the operation would be commanded from the ground by soldiers and tanks. The flag officers' images showed Russian forces ready to protect themselves. The Ukrainian army, suspicious of the situation, notified only 3 battalions that operation in Bakhmut would be organized shortly. When similar preparations began in this location, the Ukrainian army acted to detect the signals to direct contacts to a military base in Belgorod were discovered, the source of which could not be determined. 3 soldiers used the phone during the December hours. As a result of this condition, the number of suspects has been drastically reduced. It was determined, thanks to recordings made before each operation, that these soldiers were constantly supplying information via phone during this process. Recognizing a predicament the soldiers demanded, citing the need to return to the front line as the Ukrainian army, which fulfilled this request, learned that Ukrainian soldiers would flee to Belarus because listening devices had been planted on their phones during the previous operation. 3 days after patrols were sent to Belarus, the soldiers were arrested. As a result of lengthy interrogations, these soldiers divulged the names and security vulnerabilities of the military headquarters in the Soledar region. The Ukrainian army is starting to recognize this as a major opportunity. The Ukrainian army has acted to strike a huge blow to Russia. The Ukrainian army has taken control of one of the military bases near Soledar, making things much easier. The most critical security weakness at this military headquarters was a lack of air defense systems. The Ukrainian army launched spy planes in the belief that the flag bearers would make a big advance in this terrain. After conducting extensive reconnaissance in the area, these planes returned. The sudden departure of a large number of Russian troops from the military headquarters also suggested that Ukraine operation would be reasonably simple. However, in order to assure the success of the mission, Ukrainian soldiers chose to use Abrams because of their uranium-powered barrels. These tanks were effectively destroyers. The Russians lacked the capability to deal with these tanks. Russia's counter-offer of Tanay was widely and around the world. Following this action, which dragged Putin into contempt once more, the Ukrainian army went on the offensive. Ukrainian soldiers began employing heavy weaponry to finish the offensive by laying out a critical plan. It was practically impossible for Russia to resist these bombs. This action necessitated the deployment of around 35 tanks. Ukrainian special forces, on the other hand, would parachute artistically, land in the area, and deploy a large number of C-4 seconds. This would divert the headquarters' focus, preventing them from responding. The operation was taken over by Ukraine. Ukrainian special forces have joined the flag officers in their efforts. The paratrooper troops who jumped out of the plane were stationed around 2 kilometers behind the command center as the diversion was launched by the planting of C4s near this location. The tanks began to move. The idea at this stage was to keep them guessing about which direction the tanks were coming from. That's why C4 started exploding. Soldiers stationed at the Russian military headquarters have taken up positions in front of the C4 detonation site. But it was a huge mistake. The majority of Ukraine's large vehicles were approaching from the other side. The Russian forces were caught off guard since they were unaware of the scenario. Abrams began photographing while out walking. This one-of-a-kind trait radically altered the course of the conflict. The Bayraktars began to undertake surprise attacks on numerous headquarters locations. As a result, the Russian forces were obliged to take refuge in the headquarters. The Ukrainian army initially demanded surrender. He began working with Abrams after receiving no answer. The Russian army was seized by Ukrainian soldiers who broke through after the northern wall exploded in this attack. The Ukrainian army displayed its dominance over Russia once more, resulting in the capture of approximately 65 troops. Putin was enraged by all of this. As a result of the spies' exposure and the operation's success, he made key decisions. These decisions were also made in order to expand the number of KGB agents in the Ukrainian army. Many KGB spies are also reported to be among the Chechens who have just decamped in response to this situation. Ukraine's attitude toward Russia is rather obvious. He asserted that unless Ukraine retakes Crimea, it will be at odds with Russia. While Russia is concerned about the situation, it has once again proved the Ukrainian army's motivation with such a demoralized force. Russia had almost little chance against such a determined army. The Russian soldiers' paths were confusing because it was uncertain how the Ukrainian army would operate. Ukraine had already gained an advantage against Russia as a result of the information it had gathered. According to the Russian army, over 150,000 men have killed since the war began. It was uncertain what Russia would do, just as Ukraine was not expected to achieve such substantial victory in any way. Nobody could have predicted Russia would make such an open invasion attempt with excitement. The Ukrainian army surged into battle, according to military analysts. Russia has no chance if the Ukrainian military continues to fight in this manner. These findings suggest that if Ukrainian weaponry improves, Russia might be removed from Ukrainian territory fast. They also blamed Putin for the Russian army's degeneration to this point. The fear of a coup is the sole reason Putin has been defeated. To prevent a coup, Putin has rendered the army exceedingly weak. As a result of this, the Russian people must likewise suffer.